You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
It is time for our bi-weekly Women's Hockey Spotlight. That means we turn to Erica L. Ayala. And Erica, great to have you back.
Always a pleasure to be here to talk women's hockey.
Let's kick it off with the IIHF Worlds. Fill us in. What's happening there?
Well, first we have our annual tournament. It's happening in Utica, New York. The Women's World Championships happens every April. So I believe we mentioned it last time that there is a little bit of a break in the PWHL schedule. And we've had not all teams have played 2 games, but we'll have another crop of games today. We can talk about a little bit later. But, I think, Rachel, what we were kind of talking about off air is that what might be surprising to some people is Finland losing 2 games. But I don't know. Given that they've played already Canada and Czechia, I'm not as surprised.
Yeah, I think that, as we've seen over the past couple of years, Czechia is a team that has improved a lot over this time period and really has like a lot more elite players in world hockey than they've had in the past. And so I think that, if anybody was going to kind of move into that 3 slot in women's, international hockey, like Czechia is definitely a top contender there.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what's also great is, at least in that game against Finland, Team Czechia, we weren't necessarily seeing the names that people might recognize for those who follow the CWHL, the NWHL/PHF, or even the PWHL now. You're seeing some of the young talent. And I think that also speaks to, though, what we've seen at the U18 level, is that we've seen Czechia also be competitive. And I feel like we've talked about it on the program before, Gil, but when you have a pipeline of talent, and we've seen Czechia, I'd argue even on the boys and men's side, you've seen that they've really started to develop their talent young. And I think that's, growing dividends right now. And we'll see. They're going to have a game. They play the US, I believe it is today. Yes.
Yeah.
April 5th. So that's going to be a big one. Canada and Switzerland also playing today, and Sweden and China. But I mean, Gil, just again, talking about the pipeline, this is a country that I think we're really seeing is developing talent young, and they're anchoring that talent throughout North America, not just in the NCAA and even U Sports for some of these countries, but also now in professional leagues.
Yeah, and it's an investment. You make that investment when they're young, and you bring them along, and hopefully it pays dividends. And for so long, we've talked about the United States and Canada being head and shoulders above the rest of the competition in women's hockey. And it's good to see other teams starting to rise and sort of lower that gap between the big 2 and everybody else.
Yeah, for sure. And I think they're getting even scoring as well. But that kind of takes me to go to the leaders, at least among the skaters first. And we see some familiar names, maybe surprising to some people following the PWHL, but top scorers coming from the US and Canada right now. And that is one forward, Hillary Knight, and defender Ella Shelton. Now, both are in the PWHL, but we've talked about how Hillary Knight, maybe a little bit of a slow crawl offensively for PWHL Boston, Rachel, but here she is once again in international competition. It's only been 1 game for the US, as we mentioned, but still at the top of the table.
Yeah, it is interesting to see, is this because they played Switzerland, quality of competition? Is it because Hillary Knight always takes it up a notch in international competition versus maybe the slog of a regular season pro league? We know that, even in the NHL, regular season is a different thing from playoffs, and this could have a similar mentality thing. But yeah, I think it is interesting. You've got Kendall Coyne-Schofield already in the top 5 there as well. And so are the leaders of Team USA rising to the challenge for this particular tournament?
It's very possible. I mean, we talk about veteran leadership in just about any sport. It makes a difference. And in a short tournament where you really have to get your A game out the gate and work to develop over time, but in quick succession, like you have to have a quick turnaround. I think that veteran leaders, they just know what is required. They know the level of competition, relatively speaking. And so maybe that does have something to do with it. But we talked about Team Czechia. They have some young guns that have been scoring. And Rachel, we also see that, the US has a young defender also in the mix. Again, it's only been the one game. You also did mention it's been Switzerland, but Haley Wynn comes from Clarkson University, also in the top 3 scoring right now in the IIHF Women's Worlds Tournament.
Yeah, it's really good to see. And I think, one of the things that, the narrative around Team USA is, can they make this transition from the veteran names that we're all used to, like a Hillary Knight, like a Kendall Coyne-Schofield, into a next generation of players and continue the level of success they've had. And she's a prime example of that.
Yeah, for sure. And we were talking offline also that is from Rochester, New York. So maybe also just kind of familiar with the territory. And I would imagine has at least some family, if not friends, and maybe even former teammates kind of coming through to support. So Haley Wynn, again, played at Clarkson or was playing at Clarkson University. Tallied 39 points overall this season, 23-24, 10 goals and 29 assists as a defender, and is also familiar with the team that we want to talk about in our next bullet point here, and that is The Ohio State University. Clarkson fell in the postseason to Ohio State en route to OSU's second national championship. Congratulations to The Ohio State University. I remember talking to Nadine Muzerall, and she is a firecracker of a human. And from what I've heard, has also been very much advocating for OSU. This is a relatively new program. They're investing, to Gil, your point earlier, they've been investing in the women's program. And, Coach Muzerall is kind of a no-nonsense coach. Plays in the WCHA, which we know is a conference just stacked historically with national champions. Actually, Clarkson being the only, still the only national champion outside of the WCHA. They play in, I believe it's the ECHA. And so I think this is great to have a young team, a young program, I should say, really be able to come out the gate. And we've also seen, Gil, that college hockey is catching on in, quote unquote, these non-traditional markets. We've seen in North Carolina, there's been an expansion. I mean, I'm not to make it all about the Seattle Kraken, but Joey Decord maybe, has made the ASU situation a little bit more palatable, at least to Kraken fans, because there's a good storyline, him going back to a place where he never played, but he did play for that program, but not in Mullet Arena. But, the rise of the college game, I think, is going to be very interesting to see how it impacts both the men's and women's professional side. I mean, do you see that as a viable, option outside of just the junior track? Do you think we'll see more people stick with the NCAA down the road?
I think we will. And I think it's, over the years, I remember even when I was back in school, the pipeline was a lot less, and it has grown over the years. And, you mentioned Ohio State winning the Frozen Four. Now there's talk. I'm a Michigan alum. Michigan Wolverines only have a club team right now, but there's talk. Hey, if Ohio State won, maybe it's time for us to upgrade and have a varsity team for women's hockey. So it's all positive in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And the University of Delaware recently announced plans for a D1 women's program as well. And it's being supported by the Philadelphia Flyers NHL team. and they've already hired their head coach. They're not going to play their first season, not this coming year, but the following year, because it takes a lot of planning to put a D1 program together. But they're well on their way, and I just see the growth of D1 programs in women's hockey as something to really look forward to. I do want to say just a quick note about Ohio State. Love to see Joy Dunn as Rookie of the Year in women's college hockey. We all know, and I think like in the Ohio State women's hockey community, like Jinsey Dunn is the name that we all know from Ohio State, and this is her younger sister. So it's good to see that family tradition continue with an absolutely elite level of women's hockey.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that, sibling connections. We know that they are very strong in hockey in particular, it seems like. But also shout out to Kayla Barnes, who, just came into, the NCAA at a time where she's been able to expand her eligibility for quite some time, but finally gets a championship, played with Boston College for a number of years, and then went through the transfer portal to OSU, and so now has a national title.
Very, very good. Very, very good. Talk to us a little bit about the PWHL. What's happening there?
Yeah, so I think we mentioned it on our last segment that there's a little bit of a break, and that's because 39 different players from the PWHL are actually competing in the IIHF Women's Worlds tournament. So we've already mentioned Hillary Knight. We've already mentioned Kendall Coyne-Schofield. We've mentioned Ella Shelton. Actually, all three of them playing for different teams, with Boston, with Minnesota, and with New York. Shelton in New York. So there's a little bit of a break there. Teams are still practicing for those athletes not competing in Worlds, so they'll just get a little bit more repetition. It also means for some of those players that we've seen on the injured reserve, maybe just a little bit more time to focus on their recovery and hopefully get back to the ice. But also, we got an announcement that we know what the players are going to be playing for. They have announced that the trophy for the PWHL, and a lot of people wondering, because of course the Isabel Cup was the trophy in the PHF. It started with the NWHL. The CWHL had the Clarkson Cup. And so the PWHL will have the Walter Cup. And per the press release, the naming of the Walter Cup was proposed by sports icon and PWHL advisory board member Billie Jean King. And if you're wondering who is Walter, or the Walter family more specifically, Mark and Kimbra Walter are a part of, and effectively the ownership group that owns the PWHL. So the Walter Cup was created in partnership with global luxury jeweler Tiffany & Company. We see a lot of leagues actually use Tiffany. I think the WNBA did Tiffany. I think maybe even the NWHL and the original Isabel Cup with the handles might have had a Tiffany's connection, if I remember correctly. But anyway, I think it's great that we have a name for the cup. I at best am indifferent that it's named after effectively the owner of the entire league. You see this kind of stuff. People name buildings and schools and, I don't know, all kinds of things after themselves or people in their family. And there's also a little part of me, Rachel, that's kind of like, is this really the best we could do? And maybe that's just because the Clarkson Cup and especially the Isabel Cup had such a history, and the Isabel Cup it linked to women in hockey.
Yeah, I think that it's a little sad, I have to say, just because I liked the tradition of the Isabel Cup and that it was Isabel Stanley, and so there was a connection to men's hockey. And I kind of do feel like it should be named after a woman, but I understand it.
Yeah, and Gil, we were kind of talking offline. It's money and just kind of name recognition. When you own the league, you can kind of do what you want.
It's free advertising, right? That's really, in a sense, what it is. But yeah, so at least we have a name.
Yes.
We know
have a
that.
name, the Walter Cup. Now, I think it will be interesting to see if they take an opportunity to lean into women's sports, or specifically women's hockey history, a la the way we see with the NHL, by naming trophies after prominent players. Now, do you need to wait till they play in the PWHL to do that? Can you name a trophy after someone who's never set foot in the league? I mean, I guess those are questions. I think the answer, of course, is yes. You can do whatever you want. I mean, you named it the Walter Cup. Why not? But I think it's curious. I'll be curious to see if and how any women, specifically women in hockey, are represented in maybe some of the individual awards.
Well, it should happen that way, and let's hope that it most certainly does.